If someone told you that in 2026, a handful of ordinary people, from mechanics to farmers to small workshop owners, were suddenly becoming millionaires thanks to machines built by an African inventor, you'd probably scroll right past it. It sounds like clickbait. It sounds impossible. It sounds like one of those tech conspiracy videos that never leads anywhere. But this time it's different. Because the machines in question weren't designed for Wall Street traders, hedge funds, or Silicon Valley billionaires. They were built for people who actually do things, people who operate small factories, who run fleets, who manage energy demands, who produce value through work rather than speculation. And the name behind them is Maxwell Chikumbutso. Over the past decade, global innovation has been obsessed with software. Startups raised billions selling apps, platforms, and NFTs. But by 2026, the bubble burst. What the world needed wasn't another subscription service. It needed physical innovation. Hardware, power systems, energy solutions, industrial automation. And while major economies struggled to pivot, Maxwell had already spent years quietly building machines that solved real problems. The result was a new class of industrial technology, compact, efficient, and shockingly profitable. At first, the machines surfaced in small industrial parks in Africa. A water facility in Johannesburg reported a 70% reduction in its operational power costs. A logistics firm in Lusaka tripled its profit margins after deploying Maxwell's autonomous charging modules for electric trucks. A textile workshop in Kigali reduced downtime by nearly 40% using Maxwell's adaptive power units. But the most surprising success stories didn't come from corporations. They came from ordinary individuals. Take one example, a small fleet owner in Dar es Salaam who operated 8 electric delivery vans. Before Maxwell's machines, battery charging was his biggest expense. It cost him thousands monthly and limited his operational routes. After integrating Maxwell's autonomous charger modules, units that harvested and stored energy without depending on unstable grid access, his fleet costs collapsed. Within a year, he wasn't just profitable, he was expanding. Another example, a pair of brothers running a small plastics recycling facility. In 2025, rising energy prices nearly forced them to shut down. By mid-2026, they had installed one of Maxwell's micropower conversion units. It stabilized their energy supply, reduced outages, and slashed electrical expenses. With their savings, they purchased additional sorting equipment and doubled throughput. Their story made regional news, not because they got lucky, but because they solved an actual industrial bottleneck. So, what exactly are these machines? They're part of a new category insiders are calling profit infrastructure. Unlike consumer gadgets, profit infrastructure doesn't entertain you, distract you, or collect your data. It quietly sits in a factory, a power room, or a vehicle bay and generates money through efficiency. Less waste, less downtime, more output, more stability, more optimization. One of the first machines to gain attention was a modular power unit called the AM92. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't hyped. It didn't even look futuristic. But it did something unbelievably valuable. It converted irregular, unstable, or low-quality power into stable industrial-grade power with almost no energy loss. Factories that used it could run older equipment at higher efficiency. Farms could stabilize irrigation pumps. Workshops could keep CNC machines operational during grid fluctuations. Within 6 months, AM92 units were being installed in metal shops, milling plants, and cold storage facilities, often without the owners even knowing who Maxwell Chikumbutso was. To them, it wasn't innovation. It was survival. But there's another layer to this story. By early 2026, a quiet network of distributors, small business owners, fleet managers, agricultural suppliers began treating Maxwell's machines as investment opportunities. They didn't use them for themselves. They leased them. They installed them at industrial sites. They provided power as a service. They built microbusiness models around hardware that was designed for resilience. Some leased AM92 units to workshops and took a percentage of operational savings. Others installed autonomous charging modules in truck depots and charged fleet operators by the hour. One entrepreneur in Lagos even built a microgrid rental service for rural manufacturing clusters, something that didn't exist before Maxwell's hardware made it possible. In other words, these machines didn't just save money, they created industries. And that's where the millionaire stories began. Not because Maxwell sold magic boxes, but because he sold industrial leverage. He sold multipliers. He sold tools that turned operational pain points into revenue streams. While Western investors chased AI models and blockchain apps, a quiet industrial revolution was happening in warehouses, workshops, and machine rooms across Africa. And yet, the biggest breakthrough hadn't rolled out publicly, at least not at first. There was one machine in Maxwell's portfolio that observers whispered about. The one that journalists tried and failed to get access to. The one that energy analysts speculated could permanently change the economics of small-scale manufacturing. It was known internally as the S-line. And when the S-line finally surfaced, everything shifted. The first images of the S-line leaked from a logistics hub outside Gaborone. Grainy footage showed technicians unloading a squat, rectangular machine from a shipping container. No markings, no branding, just a dull matte shell with a series of ports and cooling vents. The clip lasted only 14 seconds, but it was enough for analysts to notice something unusual. No fuel lines, no external battery pack, no grid connection in sight. A week later, a second leak appeared. This time it wasn't a blurry video, it was data. A single spreadsheet attached to an anonymous email sent to a regional trade journalist. The sheet contained performance metrics from a food processing plant running 3 S-line units in parallel. The numbers didn't make sense. The plant's daily power consumption had dropped by nearly half, even though output increased. Downtime due to electrical irregularities hit zero. Equipment failure dropped by 28%. Maintenance costs shrank. If these numbers were real, the S-line wasn't just another industrial tool, it was a competitive weapon. Within days, the story broke into the international tech press. Energy analysts tried to reverse engineer the spreadsheet. Manufacturing lobbyists downplayed the claims. Online forums argued about Maxwell's history, his patents, his controversies, his alleged breakthroughs. But while debates raged in comment sections and boardrooms, the real action was happening in the supply chain. Because the S-line units didn't flood the market. They didn't go mass retail. There was no consumer launch, no pre-order campaign, no trade show unveiling. Instead, they were allocated. Quietly.
Strategically.
Only to operators whose businesses depended on machinery running without interruption, cold storage facilities, injection molding plants, beverage bottlers, textile mills, grain processors, CNC workshops, sectors where 1 hour of downtime could erase a week's profit. And those allocations set off a chain reaction. Owners who received S-line units started expanding capacity, while their competitors struggled with rising energy costs and unstable grids. Small factories suddenly outperformed larger competitors. Regional suppliers displaced foreign imports. Contracts that once flowed to multinational corporations began landing in the hands of local firms, and nobody understood why. Except the people who owned S-lines. They didn't need marketing. They didn't need hype. All they needed was uptime. And then came the leasing models. Because not everyone could secure an S-line allocation. And that scarcity created a second wave of wealth. Those who had units began leasing them to those who didn't. Some charged per hour of operation. Others charged a percentage of production. A few bundled the S-line with additional maintenance services, creating full industrial support companies from thin air. Suddenly, a machine that fit through a standard doorway was functioning like revenue infrastructure. Earned income, passive income, licensing income, service income, all generated by hardware that didn't even exist in mainstream catalogs. By mid-2026, early S-line owners were reporting profits that traditional investors would consider absurd. The technology press called it the hardware arbitrage revolution. Economists rejected the term. Industrial operators didn't care what anyone called it because they were too busy signing contracts. But behind the money, behind the quiet industrial shift, there was a deeper layer that only a handful of analysts noticed. The S-line wasn't designed for factories. It was designed for ecosystems. Energy-efficient equipment doesn't just power machines, it relocates economic gravity. When a town can run cold storage, it can export produce. When a workshop can run CNC machines without power cuts, it can supply aerospace parts. When a textile mill becomes profitable, entire supply chains form around it: dye houses, packaging firms, transport fleets, repair technicians. Money follows infrastructure. Maxwell wasn't just building machines. He was building economic scaffolding for small industrial players, people who had always been stuck between unreliable grids and expensive generators. And if there was any doubt left, it vanished when the third machine entered the picture. This one didn't leak. It was demonstrated, deliberately, in front of a select audience of 12 people, none of whom were celebrities, politicians, or billionaires. They were industrialists, fleet coordinators, microgrid architects, people who understood what a machine could do long before the market caught on. Maxwell stepped into the small workshop, placed the machine on a concrete floor, and powered it on. It wasn't the sound that stunned the room. It was the silence. No combustion, no mechanical vibration, no exhaust. And then Maxwell did something unexpected. He didn't connect it to factory equipment. He connected it to a building. The overhead lights flickered for a moment as the transfer completed, and then the entire building, workshop, office, storage rooms, was running off the machine in the middle of the floor. Air compressors kicked in. Power tools idled on standby. CNC drivers hummed quietly. Not a single breaker tripped. Not a single cable overheated. The grid connection was physically severed, yet the building didn't flinch. One of the observers, a facilities engineer from a mid-sized manufacturing firm, leaned closer to inspect the power rails. His expression didn't change, but his breathing did, because he knew exactly what he was looking at, and it terrified him. Not in the sci-fi sense, but in an economic one. This wasn't backup power. It wasn't a generator. It wasn't a UPS. It was a displacement machine. The kind of device that takes an entire category of cost, energy, downtime, distribution, infrastructure, and pushes it off the balance sheet. And displacement machines are dangerous, because industries don't collapse when new technology arrives, they collapse when costs disappear. While the observers took measurements and screenshots, Maxwell quietly explained the commercial model. The machine wasn't for consumers. It wasn't for hobbyists. It wasn't for tech influencers or YouTubers. It was for operators, people who needed uptime, capacity, and reliability more than they needed corporate branding. Each unit would be licensed to an operator who would then deploy it as part of a distributed industrial cluster. Not a single megafactory, not a centralized megagrid, not a national rollout, but thousands of micromanufacturers, microprocessors, micrologistics hubs, all linked by a new form of local infrastructure. An observer from Dubai broke the silence with a single question. So, what do you call this machine? Maxwell paused for a few seconds, not dramatically, but thoughtfully, before answering. It's not a generator. It's not storage. It's not supply. It's uptime. The room didn't react with applause. They reacted with calculation. Because uptime isn't measured in watts. It's measured in money, in contracts secured, in equipment preserved, in trucks that don't sit idle at loading bays, in perishable goods that don't spoil, in labor hours that aren't wasted. That demonstration became the seed of a new market, something analysts would later call uptime arbitrage. An entire financial category built around the idea that if you could guarantee continuous operation in a world of unstable grids, fragile supply chains, and fluctuating energy prices, you could monetize reliability itself. Leasing firms began forming within weeks. Some operators bundled machines with maintenance contracts. Others bundled them with industrial analytics. A few bundled them with financing, creating end-to-end modernization packages that traditional banks didn't know how to classify. Meanwhile, news of the demonstration never hit mainstream headlines. There were no viral clips, no heavily edited launch events, no glossy marketing. But in private circles, WhatsApp groups, LinkedIn threads, procurement networks, the demonstrations circulated like wildfire. And somewhere between the hype and the skepticism, something unexpected happened. Foreign manufacturers began placing inquiries. First from India, then from Vietnam, then from Brazil. Not the governments, private industrial groups, fabricators, cold chain operators, fleet depots, logistics corridors. They didn't care about Maxwell's biography or political narratives. They cared about uptime ratios and payback periods. And while most of the world was still debating whether the machines violated physics or merely optimized it, the people who actually needed them were running spreadsheets. What's even stranger is that Maxwell didn't scale supply to match demand. He didn't flood the market. He didn't chase volume. Instead, distribution tightened. Allocations narrowed. Certification requirements hardened. And machines only went to operators who understood the deployment model. Because that third machine, the one that powered a building, came with a condition. It could not be resold. Only leased. Only operated. Only deployed. It wasn't hardware, it was leverage packaged as hardware. And that's when the millionaire stories shifted again. Because the first wave made money by using the machines. The second wave made money by leasing them. But the third wave made money by structuring them, by building ecosystems around uptime, reliability, and industrial independence. By late 2026, analysts noticed a strange pattern in African manufacturing data. Regions with Maxwell deployments showed a rise in small industrial output, while regions without them showed stagnation or decline. Yet very few people connected the dots. The only people who understood what was coming were the ones already moving quietly in the background, forming industrial clusters, negotiating exclusive leasing territories, bundling maintenance contracts, and securing early positioning in what might become the first African-origin industrial hardware boom in modern history. But the real twist wasn't in Africa. It was in Europe. Because in November 2026, a regulatory leak revealed something nobody expected. A major EU industrial commission wasn't investigating Maxwell's machines for safety. They were investigating them for compliance. Compliance with what? Grid dependency laws. Grid dependency laws were never written to protect innovation. They were written to preserve infrastructure control. In most developed economies, large-scale energy consumers are legally or contractually tied to national grids, even when alternative power exists. This ensures predictable demand, stable pricing models, and revenue for utility operators. Maxwell's machines broke that logic. Because if a factory could legally disconnect from the grid, or even partially offload its energy demand onto privately controlled uptime systems, it would rewrite the economics of power distribution. Utilities wouldn't just lose money, they would lose leverage. By the time the leak surfaced, three things had already happened. First, European energy analysts had identified Maxwell's S-line and uptime units as a structural threat to grid economics. Second, industrial lobbies began pressuring regulators to classify these machines as grid disruptive, a category normally reserved for massive industrial generators. Third, lawyers started drafting arguments claiming that factories powered by uptime infrastructure should still pay grid participation fees, even if they didn't use grid power. Meanwhile, small to mid-size European manufacturers saw something completely different. They saw liberation. For them, energy wasn't ideological, it was existential. Rising electrical costs, volatile gas pricing, carbon taxes, and unstable international supply chains were already crippling competitiveness. Chinese and Turkish factories could undercut European prices by double digits. Automation alone wasn't enough to compensate. Energy was the bottleneck. When rumors spread that uptime machines could reduce dependency by 40% to 80%, manufacturers didn't hesitate. They filed inquiries. They requested private demonstrations. They looked for loopholes in grid compliance rules. Some even began exploring joint ventures in Africa, where deployment was legal, to produce goods more cheaply and then import them back into Europe for less than the cost of local production. Economists called it industrial offshoring through energy arbitrage. Politicians called it unpatriotic. But while Europe wrestled with grid compliance, another continent was paying attention for a different reason entirely. North America wasn't worried about grids. It was worried about supply chains. Because if small African industrial clusters could reduce costs through uptime arbitrage, they could become globally competitive in categories the West never expected: cold chain logistics, micromanufacturing, precision machining, specialty textiles, agricultural processing. The very sectors that require reliability more than scale. The concern wasn't theoretical. By Q3 of 2026, two African cold storage consortiums began exporting perishables with less spoilage loss than major Western supply chains. A Rwandan machining cooperative secured aerospace-compatible tolerances on titanium parts without grid interruptions. A Nigerian textile mill began undercutting European fabric producers by 15% on energy-dependent dye processes. None of these companies were multinationals. None had billion-dollar budgets. They were small clusters empowered by uptime hardware and new leasing models. Meanwhile, Maxwell remained almost entirely out of the media cycle, not because he hid, but because industrial operators didn't want him in headlines. They wanted machines, not celebrity. In a world obsessed with hype-driven launches, Maxwell's ecosystem was driven by procurement contracts, supply scheduling, and operational secrecy. However, secrecy has a side effect. It attracts the wrong kind of curiosity. By mid-November, major hedge funds and private equity firms began quietly probing the African leasing networks, trying to understand who controlled allocations, how many units existed, and what kind of revenue they produced. They weren't interested in technology. They were interested in ownership. But ownership wasn't on the table. Because by then, something even more disruptive had emerged, not from Maxwell directly, but from the ecosystem forming around his machines. A financing instrument. Not a token. Not a crypto scheme. Not a stock. A hardware-backed industrial note tied to uptime revenue. In simple terms, investors could finance an operator deploying uptime machines, and instead of receiving interest, they received a percentage of uptime-based profit, directly linked to the performance of factories, cold chains, or workshops using the machines. For the first time, Africa wasn't exporting raw materials. It was exporting industrial reliability as a financial asset. Those industrial notes sold out faster than anyone expected. Not because investors understood the technology, but because they understood guaranteed uptime contracts. When a cold storage facility guarantees fruit preservation, or a machining shop guarantees tolerance delivery, or a textile mill guarantees dye completion, the returns are real, measurable, defensible. Suddenly, Maxwell's machines weren't just creating millionaires. They were creating a new financial class. Operators who controlled deployment. Technicians who controlled maintenance. Distributors who controlled territory. Financiers who controlled industrial notes. And leasing firms who controlled access. And yet, one question remained unanswered. The question on the minds of energy regulators, hedge fund analysts, industrial strategists, and rival manufacturers. How far would Maxwell push deployment? Because machines can generate revenue, but networks generate power. And Maxwell wasn't building machines, he was building a network. Networks behave differently than products. A product can be copied, improved, reverse-engineered, or banned. A network must be competed with, and that's far harder. Because a network doesn't scale through advertising or influencers. It scales through incentives, through alignment, through the simple logic that when enough independent actors benefit from participation, the network becomes self-reinforcing. That's what started happening at the edge of the Maxwell ecosystem. At first, uptime clusters formed organically, a cold storage facility here, a machining shop there, a textile mill 2 towns over. Each cluster solving its own reliability problem, each generating profit quietly. But by late 2026, clusters began linking together. Not physically, economically. A cold storage operator in Botswana signed a supply contract with a textile exporter in Kenya, coordinated by a logistics firm in Namibia, all three using uptime infrastructure to guarantee operational windows. Suddenly, contracts had teeth. Delivery windows were met. Spoilage rates dropped. Manufacturing tolerances held. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't futuristic. It wasn't the kind of innovation that goes viral on social media. It was simply reliable. And reliability has a gravitational pull. Other companies started orbiting these clusters. packaging providers, printers, maintenance crews, transport fleets, security firms, agricultural cooperatives. Each layer added more uptime demand, which justified more machine deployment, which created more uptime capacity, which attracted more contracts. From the outside, it looked like a normal supply chain. From the inside, it was a new industrial organism. Meanwhile, European regulators continued wrestling with compliance frameworks. North American strategists debated countermeasures. Asian manufacturers studied leasing models, but Africa wasn't waiting for permission. Territory licensing became the next front. Not territory in the geopolitical sense, territory in the industrial sense. Operators started negotiating exclusive uptime service rights across zones, industries, and supply lines. The right to deploy machines in cold chain corridors, in textile districts, in precision machining clusters, in agricultural processing hubs. These rights behaved like digital spectrum auctions or rail concessions, limited, valuable, defensible. And this is where the third millionaire wave emerged. Because the first millionaire wave came from operators using the machines. The second wave came from operators leasing the machines. But the third wave came from operators controlling territory. Territory meant predictable leasing revenue. Predictable leasing revenue meant bankable notes. Bankable notes meant infrastructure-level financing. That's when conventional financiers entered the picture, not through venture capital or crypto speculation, but through institutional credit, sovereign funds, and infrastructure banks. Because once uptime became a line item on infrastructure proposals, Maxwell's machines moved from experimental hardware to industrial assets. Bankers don't care about hype. They care about risk-adjusted yield. And uptime offered something the global market desperately lacked in 2026: insulation from volatility. Insulation from grid volatility. Insulation from fuel volatility. Insulation from supply chain volatility. Insulation from geopolitical volatility. The irony is that the very same volatility that hurt traditional factories is what made uptime clusters profitable. Meanwhile, Maxwell moved differently. He didn't seek patents as commercial shields, he used them as diplomatic instruments. He didn't seek media exposure, he sought industrial alignment. He didn't seek mass adoption, he sought controlled deployment. Traditional tech scaling models push for speed. Uptime scaling models push for stability. And that stability is precisely why big corporate players couldn't replicate the strategy. They were built for high-volume manufacturing, not low-volume network formation. They wanted to own the machines, not the ecosystems. That mismatch created the final, unexpected twist. Corporations started acquiring uptime operators, not for their machines, but for their territories and contracts. In some cases, uptime operators sold their clusters for 12x to 18x EBITDA. In other cases, they refused acquisition entirely and expanded into neighboring markets. The mergers began quietly, then accelerated. First logistics firms buying cold chain operators, then textile conglomerates buying dyeing facilities, then aerospace suppliers acquiring machining cooperatives. But the real shock came when one of Europe's largest industrial conglomerates attempted to buy a controlling stake in an African uptime territory and was denied by the local operators association. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. This ecosystem isn't for sale. That decision rippled through capital markets, intelligence networks, and industrial strategy forums. Because for the first time in recent history, industrial leverage wasn't concentrated in Manhattan, Frankfurt, Shenzhen, or Tokyo. It was concentrated in decentralized African uptime clusters. And behind those clusters was a single strategic architect. Not a politician. Not a billionaire. Not a military strategist. A builder. Maxwell Chikumbutso. The machines created millionaires. The clusters created markets. But the network was beginning to create something else entirely. And this is where things get even more interesting. Because governments didn't just watch from the sidelines. South Africa, Kenya, and the UAE reportedly began exploring policy frameworks to fast-track small-scale industrial clusters built around modular machines like Chikumbutso's. Why? Because for the first time, a startup could manufacture real products domestically without a multi-million-dollar factory. Orders came in from industries that weren't even on the radar. solar installers who needed custom power boxes, a local EV retrofit shops, emergency service fleets, mining and rural logistics companies. Even crypto miners started buying small rugged power units to run rigs off-grid in remote sites. Completely unexpected. These machines didn't just create revenue, they created ecosystems. Suddenly you had Right Arrow training centers teaching technicians how to operate the machines. Right Arrow financing firms offering microleases. Right Arrow export brokers connecting small manufacturers to foreign buyers. Right Arrow repair shops specializing in high-voltage modules. This is how industrial revolutions actually begin, not with one giant corporation but with thousands of small workshops that add up to something larger. And now, as we enter 2026, analysts say this movement is only accelerating. The prediction? By 2028, local modular manufacturing could create over 220,000 small industrial jobs across Africa, Asia, and South America, driven not by governments, but by independent operators using privately owned machines. It sounds insane, but think about it for a second. Tesla disrupted automakers. SpaceX disrupted rockets. And now Maxwell Chikumbutso may be disrupting factories themselves. Imagine what happens when machines become